What if everything you knew about American history was only half the story? In A People's History of the United States, Howard Zinn tears down the glossy facade of traditional narratives, exposing the raw, unfiltered truth about the struggles, resilience, and resistance of those who lived in the shadows of power. This is the history of the oppressed, the indigenous, the enslaved, the workers, and the dreamers, told with the urgency of a call to action. Prepare to see the past not as a tale of triumph by the elite, but as a relentless fight for justice that shapes our world to this day. Introduction: Reframing History. Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States seeks to transform the way we understand American history. Instead of glorifying powerful leaders or framing history as the inevitable march of progress, Zinn shifts the focus to ordinary people, indigenous communities, enslaved individuals, laborers, women, and other marginalized groups. He presents history as a series of struggles, where oppressed people resisted exploitation and fought for justice, often against overwhelming odds. Zinn critiques mainstream historiography for its elite-centered perspective, arguing that this approach erases the suffering and contributions of the majority. By examining history from the ground up, Zinn not only exposes injustice but also empowers readers to see historical struggles as a roadmap for societal change. Part 1. Indigenous Peoples and the Age of Exploration. The Arrival of Columbus. Zinn begins with the arrival of Christopher Columbus, not as a tale of discovery, but as a harrowing story of exploitation and genocide. He contrasts the harmony of indigenous societies with the violence and greed of European colonizers. Columbus and his men enslaved, killed, and decimated the native populations in their quest for gold, setting a brutal precedent for the colonization of the Americas. By demythologizing Columbus, Zinn forces us to confront the darker origins of the U.S. The beginnings of American colonization. Early colonization was characterized by violence and coercion, with settlers seizing land and resources at the expense of indigenous peoples. This pattern of exploitation established the foundation for systemic oppression that would define much of American history. Part 2. The Foundations of Inequality. Slavery and the Foundations of the U.S. Economy. The American economy was built on the backs of enslaved Africans, who endured unimaginable suffering while creating vast wealth for plantation owners and merchants. Zinn examines the transatlantic slave trade, the rise of chattel slavery, and the dehumanization of African Americans. He also highlights resistance, both subtle and overt, showing that enslaved individuals were not passive victims but active participants in their fight for freedom. Class struggles in early America. Economic inequality shaped early America, where poor farmers and laborers often rebelled against the elite. Zinn discusses events like Shays' Rebellion, demonstrating how wealth concentration created persistent class tensions and set the stage for future conflicts. Part 3. Expansion and Imperialism. Westward expansion and indigenous displacement. As the U.S. expanded westward, indigenous peoples faced systemic displacement and destruction. Zinn details policies like the Trail of Tears and how Manifest Destiny justified these atrocities. The narrative of progress was built on the suffering of native communities, whose land and lives were sacrificed for the ambitions of settlers and the government. Mexican-American War and Imperial Ambitions. The Mexican-American War was another example of American imperialism, resulting in the annexation of vast territories like Texas and California. This expansion came at the expense of Mexican citizens and native groups, illustrating the U.S.'s willingness to use military power for land acquisition. Part 45. Civil War and Reconstruction. The Role of Slavery in the Civil War. Zinn explores how economic and political tensions over slavery led to the Civil War. While emancipation freed millions of enslaved people, the aftermath revealed the fragility of progress. African Americans faced violence, systemic discrimination, and economic exploitation, demonstrating that the fight for equality was far from over. The failures of Reconstruction. Reconstruction efforts were undermined by institutionalized racism. Black codes and Jim Crow laws reinforced white supremacy, and African Americans continued their struggle for rights and dignity in the face of relentless opposition. Part 5. Industrialization and Worker Struggles. The Rise of Industrial Capitalism. Industrialization brought significant technological progress but also created stark inequalities. Immigrant and working-class laborers were exploited in unsafe factories and mines, while industrialists like Rockefeller and Carnegie amassed immense wealth. Workers organized strikes and unions demanding fair treatment and rights, but these efforts were often met with brutal repression. The Gilded Age and wealth inequality. The Gilded Age highlighted the growing divide between the rich and poor. Zinn emphasizes that the opulence of the era was built on the suffering of countless laborers, whose struggles for justice were a defining feature of this period. Part 6. Wars and their consequences. World War I and domestic repression. Zinn critiques U.S. involvement in World War I, arguing it was driven by economic interests rather than democratic ideals. At home, dissenters, particularly socialists and activists, faced severe repression under laws like the Espionage Act. World War II and post-war hegemony. While World War II brought economic growth, Zinn points out its uneven benefits. The war solidified the U.S.'s position as a global superpower but left marginalized communities struggling with systemic inequality. Part 7. Civil rights and social movements. Zinn highlights the pivotal role of grassroots activism in achieving milestones like desegregation and voting rights. He underscores that systemic resistance to change required sustained efforts by figures like Martin Luther King Jr. and countless unnamed activists. The anti-war movement. The Vietnam War spurred widespread opposition, revealing deep dissatisfaction with U.S. imperialism. Anti-war activists questioned the morality of American foreign policy and highlighted its devastating human costs. Feminism and other liberation movements. Zinn explores the feminist movement's fight for workplace rights, reproductive freedom, and gender equality. He also examines other liberation movements, emphasizing the interconnectedness of struggles against oppression. Part 8. The late 20th century and beyond. The Reagan era and the growth of corporate power. Policies under Reagan prioritized corporate interests and deregulation, widening economic disparities. Zinn critiques the political alignment with the wealthy at the expense of the working class and marginalized communities. Globalization and resistance. Globalization brought economic challenges for workers worldwide, exacerbating inequalities. Zinn highlights grassroots movements that resisted neoliberal policies, showing the enduring spirit of collective action. History as a tool for change. Zinn concludes by emphasizing that history is not just a record of the past but a tool for creating a better future. He argues that change comes from the collective efforts of ordinary people. By learning from past struggles, readers can find hope and inspiration to continue the fight for justice, equality, and solidarity.